Welcome to APUSH. This is our lecture 8.5 addendum on the French Revolution. I'm just going to give you the briefest overview here because hopefully you already studied this in world history and it's not content that's specifically assessed in this class, but to have a good understanding of the American Revolution and the period after the American Revolution, you need to know at least something about the French Revolution and the forces that drove it. So, without further ado, here is my super quick overview of the French Revolution. So, French Revolution obviously happened in France. Hopefully, you remember France, massive, important feudal kingdom, huge agricultural yields, one of the great powers of Europe, Louis XIV, the Sun King, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, all of that clearly factors into the French Revolution. But Louis XIV might have overspent just slightly on his housing, and he might have gotten involved in a couple wars, that weren't expressly necessary, say War of the Spanish Succession, etc. And so he might have left his heirs in a little bit of debt. And then you've got the whole problem of Louis XV being basically uninterested in governing and spending all his time out hunting. And yeah, so that doesn't necessarily lead to good leadership. And so just a few problems in French society might have been slightly overlooked by the rulers, like the estate system. Hopefully, you remember the estate system from world history. It's the one that divided people up into the only three categories that mattered: the clergy who mattered, the nobles who mattered, and everyone else who didn't matter. Except they did matter somewhat because they could be taxed. Whereas the first estate and the second estate were immune from taxes, despite holding the vast amount of the wealth. So, this is obviously somewhat of an oversimplified equation because obviously as the industrial revolution started to happen, more and more people in the third estate started gaining wealth, and they started buying up property, and the ones that could started buying up noble estates in order to exempt themselves from taxes. So all of that stuff was factored in. But I mean, the important thing is France owed a ridiculous amount of money and had like zero revenue streams or very limited revenue streams. And so it became difficult to pay back your loans when you're exempting a significant amount of your wealth from taxes. The French finances came to a head under the reign of Louis XVI, who you're probably familiar with. He had kind of an unfortunate reign. It was, yeah, not great for him. But he had a couple different finance ministers who tried a variety of different techniques to get the French government through it. My favorite is Jacques Necker, who his strategy for getting the French through it was to completely ignore the debt and then lie about it. So he published this accounting of the French finances called the Compte Rendu that you see here, which listed all the money that the king, all the entire, basically the entire economic apparatus of the kingdom, except he left out all the debts because he divided everything into like normal expenditures versus extraordinary expenditures. And he put all the debts in extraordinary expenditures and then just left them out of the accounting. So not only was the French government about to go broke, but everyone had just read a book that said that they were flush with money. So yeah, talk about cognitive dissonance. Necker was followed by Cologne, by Inspector General Cologne, who realized that they would have to raise taxes and actually pass reforms. And so Cologne tried to do this, but everyone was totally convinced that everything was fine, and they thought Cologne was lying. And so, again, zero reforms, and no progress was made. The only way the king could raise taxes and could solve this problem was to call the Estates General. The Estates General is a basic parliament made up of the three different classes, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully you remember this from world history. So they called the thing, right? And they were hoping that they'd be able to make reforms in order to solve the king's problems. But the Estates General was such a massive failure that they couldn't even get through their first point of business, which is how they would vote. Traditionally, the Estates General had voted by order, which means that the first estate gets one vote, the second estate gets one vote, and the third estate gets one vote. Hopefully, I don't have to tell you which of these two estates would vote together. And so the third estate's concerns were basically ignored. So when they got together, they couldn't even agree if they should use that system or if they should give the third estate at least equal say in the process. So the Estates General collapsed almost immediately and was formed into a new legislative body called the National Assembly. The National Assembly was based on the principle that all Frenchmen were equal, a document that was eventually laid out in the famous tract, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And in this decree, the delegates of the Third Estate swore the famous tennis court oath that they would meet as a national assembly until the problems of France were solved. So that's awesome. And eventually, some members of the First Estate, specifically poor clergymen, started to come over, and some liberal nobles who wanted reform out of the Second Estate came over. And pretty quickly, the National Assembly became the legislative body of France, and they set to making all the changes that would solve all of France's problems and lead France into a new, wonderful golden age. So far, so good. Everything's spectacular. Then things start to turn. Unrest in Paris eventually leads to the fall of the Bastille. This is one of the first examples of mob violence in the French Revolution. The Bastille was a prison, and there was this idea that there were all these political prisoners held in there. But basically, why the Parisians broke in there was because they'd been collecting guns to make sure that the National Assembly did the stuff that they wanted, but they didn't have the powder to use them. And most of the powder was stored in the Bastille, so they stormed the Bastille. And after it fell, all of a sudden now the streets of Paris are filled with very well armed members of the Third Estate, which, yeah, that's not going to be intimidating at all for anybody. So now you've got armed radicals in the streets of Paris, so still everything good, I think. And so, with this somewhat uncomfortable situation, there were some successes of the French Revolution. One of the successes was armed peasant women marched on Versailles and brought the king back to Paris in order to be closer to his people. The king agreed to this because the alternative was getting massacred, which he almost was, but then somehow the Marquis de Lafayette, actually, our old friend from the American Revolution, was able to talk down the National Guardsmen and these peasant women. So Louis comes back to Paris. The National Assembly abolishes all feudal rights, which, cool. It's weird that France still had feudal rights in the late 1700s, but, the serfs are free, which, good. Unfortunately, it led to this period called the Great Fear, where peasants rose up and destroyed all the paperwork of their debts in order to try to free themselves from even more of these obligations. But eventually that was suppressed. So still, everything good. Feudal rights gone, noble titles gone, church tithes gone. So far, again, French Revolution, successful. We're pretty happy. And then France decided to pick a fight with everyone else in Europe. The way I used to teach this was the rest of the countries of Europe went to war against France because they were worried about reform, and man, that would make a lot of sense if it was true, but it is not. France provoked a war with Austria in order to try to raise money and unite the people, which, not great. And then pretty quickly, they ended up provoking a war with also Prussia, and then eventually Spain got involved and Russia got involved, and the Austrian lands in Italy got involved and England got involved. And before you know it, France is fighting all of Europe simultaneously, which, not ideal to be attempting to reform your country and single handedly fighting off all of Europe, but we'll see how it goes. Also, in their attempt to raise troops, they started forcing people to forced conscription. And this led to massive revolts in places that didn't like the revolution, most famously the Vendée region here. So now France is at war with all of the rest of Europe, and they're facing domestic uprisings. I mean, the Vendée was only one of the regions that were in revolt. There was also revolts down in Marseille and sort of in the western area or eastern areas of France. So domestic uprising and war with everybody. But the French Revolution made some changes to what they argued were the roles of citizens. They created the first modern mass citizen army with the levée en masse, where basically every single citizen was obligated to join the French army, who was every French citizen between a certain age was obligated to join the French army, and everyone else was mobilized to do their part for the war. And so France was the first modern country to embrace this idea of total war and to force all of their citizens to help function as one sort of well-oiled war machine. And so we can credit Lazare Carnot, the organizer of victory, for putting all this together. And so somehow, despite the fact that France was at war with all of Europe, they didn't get crushed. And they were sort of holding their own. So that's successful. And then the king tried to flee the country, and things went poorly. Louis the XVI was held as a virtual captive in Paris. He had already been stripped of all his power in one of the late night National Assembly sessions where they go and destroy parts of the Ancien regime when the hall is almost empty. So Louis had already lost all of his power, and then he tried to flee the country, and so he was put to death by the National Assembly. This kicked off an era called the Reign of Terror, where Jacobins, who had seized power in the increasingly radical environment of the French Revolution, began to empower a group called the Committee of Public Safety to use draconian measures to secure the success of the French Revolution. After all, the French Revolution is good. And so anything that you're doing to preserve the goodness of the French Revolution is clearly justified. So the Reign of Terror was designed to preserve these gains. So who are we killing? Well, first the king and his wife, dead. Marie Antoinette, sorry. Then all the enemies of the revolution in Paris, all those counter-revolutionaries. And then we start killing the people in the provinces who turn against us. So the Vendée, guess what? You get to be leveled and your people killed. And all of the other cities who rose up in revolt, we're going to start killing you en masse. It was actually a problem because the guillotine wasn't effective enough to kill all the people they needed to kill. So the revolutionaries built these barges that they could send out into rivers and then sink and just do mass drownings to kill all the people, because killing them by hand took too long. And even the guillotine was only killing people at a rate of somewhere in the area of 15 people an hour, right? And if you're trying to kill thousands of people, I mean, how many days are you going to spend from sunup to sundown putting people to death? At some point, you just float them out into a river and sink them, right? Problem solved. The Reign of Terror also oversaw some of the more ridiculous phases of the French Revolution. For example, they abolished the calendar and created a new calendar based on rationality. They pushed radical de-Christianization, destroyed churches and seized church lands, and tried to create a new civic religion where they would worship things like philosophy. And eventually, the guy who's the most responsible for the Reign of Terror, Maximilien Robespierre, created his own cult called the Cult of the Supreme Being, where he was being worshipped, or where he wasn't technically being worshipped, but he basically took on the persona of the prophet of a death cult. So fun. And then Robespierre totally lost it and went against all his enemies on the Committee of Public Safety, most famously Georges Danton. And so Robespierre starts liquidating people on the left who want too much reform, and people on the right who want things to go back to the way things were. This was the era where Robespierre was trying to create what he called the Republic of Virtue, which apparently could only exist once everyone who was not virtuous was dead. So that's somewhat problematic and led to more or less the end of the French Revolution. The Thermidorian reaction is the plot to overthrow Maximilien Robespierre, and you should look it up if you're interested. It's actually just utterly horrifying, but he and all his contemporaries were eventually captured and then guillotined, which ushered in this new era in France called the Directory, where a 5-member directorial committee ruled an unbelievably corrupt French state, where some of the reforms of the French Revolution were still in place, but it was basically mostly about extorting money from everybody. And we'll come back to them tomorrow because, of course, they're going to get into a fight with the United States, and it's going to almost provoke war. So, yeah, French Directory, not on the top list of the most effective governments in history. And, of course, it was short-lived because a general named Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew it in his coup d'etat. Here's Napoleon. First becoming head of what's called the consulate, where they tried to create this pseudo-Roman apparatus with Napoleon as the first consul. But that was eventually overthrown, or, I mean, it wasn't really overthrown as much as it morphed into the First French Empire, with Napoleon Bonaparte as an absolute leader and emperor. So that leads us to about 1812, where we'll pick up our narrative next time we talk about France. At this point, Napoleon conquers almost all of Europe except for the British, and this is going to have some ramifications for the United States. So I'm not going to spoil it. I'm just going to leave it here. So, arc of the French Revolution. There's some things need to change, then some things do change, then it changes way the heck too much, and all of a sudden you've got a dictator you've got an emperor trying to conquer all of Europe. So, French Revolution in a nutshell. Hope you were able to follow some of that, and honestly, more hopefully, it sparked some of the memories you had from world history, so you have some context for this whole mess. So when we mention the French Revolution in the context of either American political discourse or American foreign policy, you'll have some sense of where we are here. Thanks for listening.